210,000 deaths. Okay, yeah, let's speak about it. Because I just found the source that you cited, and Fondapol counted 48,035 Islamic terrorist attacks worldwide from 1979 through May of 2021. It resulted in 210,138 deaths. Yeah, that number is real. But here's what you left out. You only read like the first portion and then stopped reading, I guess. Because that same report says that 89.5% of those attacks occurred in Muslim countries, and 91.7% of the deaths occurred in Muslim countries. That's 92,782 deaths occurring in Muslim countries. And Fondapol itself concludes that most of the lives lost were Muslim lives. So no, I'm not going to call all 210,138 of these Muslim on Muslim deaths because the database doesn't identify every victim's religion. But your own source says that the overwhelming majority happened in Muslim countries and that most of the people who died were Muslims. And there's another huge piece of context. This is not a database of 210,138 civilians. When Fondapol breaks the attacks down by target, the largest category is actually military targets at 31.7% of the attacks. Civilians were 25%. Police were 18.3%. Again, that tells us the targets of the attacks. It doesn't necessarily mean that all 38.7% of the people killed were soldiers, but it tells us that a huge amount of the violence in the data set happened in the context of insurgencies, military, security forces, rather than being 210,138 attacks on random civilians. And then the geography makes it even clearer because Afghanistan was the single most affected country in the entire world. It says 66,662 deaths. That's one country alone accounted for 31.7% of the worldwide Islamic terrorist death toll. Its own source says that after the Taliban were driven from power by the American-led coalition following 9/11, there was an exponential increase in attacks and victims, particularly among international forces and members of the Afghan government. Between 2001 and 2012, Fondapol counted 2,536 attacks in Afghanistan that killed at least 8,054 people. The Taliban was responsible for 95.2% of these attacks. The report even says that the countries most affected by Islamist terrorism were countries that had experienced periods of war, specifically naming Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and just 4 extremist organizations, the Taliban, ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al-Qaeda, accounted for 80% of all of the victims in the entire worldwide data set. So now let's apply this body count logic consistently. So according to Fondapol's own database, Islamist terrorism caused 3,121 deaths in the United States from 1979 to 2021. Now let's compare that to firearm homicide in America. A JAMA Network Open study using CDC data counted 438,359 firearm homicides in the United States from 1990 to 2021. That's about 140 times the number of Americans killed by Islamic terrorists in Fondapol's database, despite the firearm homicide statistic covering a shorter period of time. America's 438,359
divided by 66,662.
6.5 times the entire 66,662 Islamic terrorist death toll of Afghanistan, which is the most affected country on earth. So do I take those 438,359 American deaths and call them Christian violence? No. Because ordinary homicide statistics are not religious statistics. Now let's add the military violence. Air Wars estimates that since 9/11, at least 22,679 and potentially as many as 48,308 civilians were likely directly killed by U.S. strikes, while noting that attribution in some U.S.-led coalition operations is uncertain. B'Tselem documents at least 2,996 Palestinians who were not participating in hostilities when Israeli forces killed them during the first decade after September 2000. Add another 1,391 who did not participate in hostilities during the 2014 Gaza war, another 137 during the May 2021 fighting, And that's 4,524 people across just those 3 selected periods. And separately, Human Rights Watch says approximately 900 Lebanese civilians were killed during the 2006 Lebanon War and found that Israeli airstrikes caused most of those civilian deaths. I'm keeping that 900 out of the calculation because the sources says most, not all. Because unlike this argument, I'm not trying to inflate the numbers. So if I deliberately played the exact same raw body count game and added only 438,359 U.S. firearm homicides, plus 22,679 to 48,308 civilians likely killed by U.S. strikes, plus the 4,524 person subtotal, I get between 465,562 and 491,191 deaths. Compared with your worldwide Islamist terrorist number of 210,138, that's between 2.2 and 2.3 times as many. Now, are firearm homicides, military strikes, and terrorism equivalent categories? No. That's literally the point. You can create a terrifying body count for practically any population if you mix crime, warfare, and terrorism together and then decide the number represents an entire religion. So let's stop mixing categories and do an actual extremist to extremist comparison. The U.S. Government Accountability Office looked at fatal extremist incidents in America from September 12, 2001 through the end of 2016. Far-right extremists were responsible for 62 fatal incidents. Radical Islamist extremists were responsible for 23. So that's 73% versus 27% of the fatal extremist incidents. The death tolls were much closer, 106 from far-right extremists versus 119 from the radical Islamist extremists, but 49 of those 119 radical Islamist deaths, 41% of them occurred in just that one attack at the Pulse nightclub. So yes, Islamist terrorism is real. It's horrific. I condemn it. But your statistic does not prove that Muslims are uniquely violent. Your own source says that 91.7% of those deaths occurred in Muslim countries, and your own source concludes that most of the lives lost were Muslim lives. Your own source says the military, not civilians, was the largest target category by the number of attacks. Your own source says the countries hit hardest were countries experiencing war, and your own source says 4 extremist organizations caused 80% of the victims. So you told me to speak about this. I did. You should probably start reading like an entire source instead of just the first headline you see.